Hello everyone. Welcome to the deck tech for my Battle-Hardened Cincinnati first place Iyslander Stormbind list, and the deck tech for my Battle-Hardened Chicago first place list as well. It's the same 80. I love this hero deeply, and I have been an outspoken advocate for her and specifically the Boomer Arcane variant basically since she came out. So I'm really happy to share my list with you today and walk through some of my card choices and how and why my list plays differently than the much more popular Bully Iyslander list that Michael Hamilton popularized with his US Nationals 2022 and Worlds 2022 wins. The bulk of this video will be split up into two major sections. Number one, the cards, and number two, the game plan. Let's start by diving into the cards, beginning with the equipment. Waning Moon is our only weapon. The rate of 2 resources for 2 to 3 arcane damage at instant speed is absolutely silly. The chip damage it consistently provides over the course of the game is our primary way to keep life totals even and to reduce our opponents into kill range. Coronet Peak is the only head equipment in this list. This is far and away our most consistent way to disrupt our opponent. When you flood with 4 blues, you can throw 1 at Coronet and trade your blue for a card of theirs. Since opponent's cards are typically worth 3 to 4 points of damage, and the blues in our deck block for between 0 and 3, you're effectively gaining a point or two of functional value off that trade, while slowing your opponent down. Just be careful to not Coronet when their Tunic is up, because they'll pay the 1 tax with that, and you'll basically be throwing a card away for nothing. The other important use for Coronet is that it's an outlet to flow Channel Lake Frigid without playing any cards. It's very common to play CLF on your opponent's turn, and then pitch an ice card on your turn to Coronet to strip a card from hand and keep CLF around. This scenario has the added benefit of the Channel Lake Frigid locking down your opponent's Tunic as a free resource outlet, so it's basically always a favorable trade for you as Iyslander. Tunic is our primary chest equipment. Despite being so blue heavy, we are a very resource hungry deck, and so getting a free resource every 3rd turn is very useful to smooth out awkward draws, as well as letting us maximize efficiency on some of our arsenal cards. The most standard use of Tunic in the deck is to cash in a Waning Moon after pitching a blue to play a 2-cost card from Arsenal like Channel Lake Frigid, Emeritus Scolding, or Ice Bolt. With the 1 spare resource from the blue pitch, Tunic converts into 3 free damage once every 3 turns. Iron Rock Gauntlet is a recent change for me over Iron Hide. This choice was first popularized by Michael Hamilton around Worlds last year. The logic is that it lets you on demand stop a 4-power breakpoint with a 3-block from hand, or a pesky 5-power arrow with a sink below if you're playing against Lexi. I have been thoroughly impressed with its performance recently. And Stormstriders is Stormstriders. Taking an extra turn during the game is a very good thing. It would be blasphemous to play Wizard without them. We then have 2 sideboard equipment. Metacarpus Node is very versatile, being brought in whenever we want AB1, so Wizards, Briar, and Dromai. It actually pulls double duty in the Dromai matchup. Don't be afraid to burn Metacarpus in order to kill a Thamai the turn that cycle that it's played. It's worth giving up the point of Arcane Barrier. Lastly, Alluvian Constellus is absurd value in the Wizard Mirror and versus Viserai and Vincent. Basically, matchups where incoming Arcane is plentiful. Briar doesn't quite make the cut. The first resource you spend each turn using Constellus' AB1 means a free resource on a future Waning Moon. So really, it's turning 1 resource into 2.5 damage worth of value. That is a simply absurd rate. Try to put counters on your Alluvian whenever possible. Next, we have the blues. They fall into 3 rough categories: ice cards, ice fusion cards, and other. Ice cards are the bread and butter of an Iyslander deck. Playing them out of Arsenal on opponent's turns is our primary way to generate frostbites, and thus our primary source of disruption. The ice cards here have their own subcategories, which I like to call damage, cantrips, Disruption, and Dinosaurs. The damage cards are quite obvious. Frosting, Aether Hail, and Ice Bolt are the arcane damaging cycle here. They're a reasonably good way to chip damage in, while also disrupting, though they're a little below rate. Cold Snap and Polar Blast are our cantrips. These look unassuming at first, especially Polar Blast, because the Dominate is irrelevant. But the math works out that you pitch a blue to play it from Arsenal, create a Frostbite, draw a card, and have 2 resources left over for Waning Moon. Last time I checked, Instant Speed Head Jab with Upside was a fantastic card. Cold Snap has the added bonus of sometimes disrupting our opponent's arsenals. Both of these are all-around all-stars. Speaking of all-stars, our disruption blues are Blizzard and CLF. Blizzard is really critical as the only way to consistently disrupt our opponent from hand rather than arsenal. If you double-check Iyslander's ability, it specifies ice cards you play on opponent's turns, not that they have to be from arsenal. And because Blizzard makes a Frostbite and asks your opponent to pay 2 resources, it basically trades one of your blues for an opponent's blue, or the rest of their turn if they don't have one. Either is good. Instant Speed CLF lets you cheat the first turn's worth of flow counters. It is your primary safety valve versus aggressive low AB decks to slow them down as you chip damage in. And since this list plays 6 red ice cards, you have frequent opportunities to keep it around for 2 or even 3 flow counters. It's usually worth doing so. Lastly, we have the Dinosaurs, aka Insidious Chill and Frost Hex. These cards are incredibly powerful, but they're also slow and clunky, and at most stages of most games, you don't have the breathing room to play them. They're still entirely necessary to keep in the list, though. If you were to cut them, a patient AB3 opponent with enough blues could feasibly fatigue you. Hex and Chill provide important counterplay to this strategy by letting you set up big 30 plus damage Ice Eternal endgames. Now, this isn't the primary plan into any matchup right now, except the Mirror, kind of, but it's a good tool to have in the deck's back pocket for a relatively low opportunity cost, since these are still blue ice cards. Our blue ice fusion cards make up a small but very impactful suite of disruptive tools. Blue Aether Ice Vein is absolutely silly if your opponent doesn't have AB3, and even if they do, it's a good way to deny them an arsenal by playing it at instant speed on their turn. Cards that deal 3+ arcane damage are also really important as Stormstrider's targets in order to close games. All around, the card is a solid role player. I would never think of not playing all 9 Ice Veins. Blue Brain Freeze is a blue block 3 in some matchups, and in other matchups, it's an instant speed Thoughtseize that doesn't cost any life. The card is silly, and there isn't much to say about it beyond it's great versus aggro Cheerios decks. I mentioned Ice Eternal earlier with the Dinosaurs. That's its primary reason for being in the deck. However, it has added utility in being a great turn 0 play. Don't fuse it, don't let your opponent filter their hand with Arcane Barrier. Just give your opponent 3 Frostbites and arsenal a blue card. It being a variable cost card also makes it great to get your Channel 8 Frigids up to those higher flow counters by pitching 2 ice cards to play Ice Eternal, and sometimes even a 3rd ice card to moon on top. Our other blues are a hodgepodge of generically good cards. With Tunic, pitching a blue to Emeritus and Moon from Arsenal is a 2-card 7 at instant speed, which is absolutely silly. However, I'm not really interested in arsenaling this card when Tunic isn't up, because a 2-card 4 is quite bad. Next, we're a deck that starts at lower life than our opponent, and pitches at least 1 blue every turn cycle. Heart of Fjendel is such a slam dunk in Iyslander. I really hope that LSS comes to their senses and prints accessible, affordable, non foil versions of it and all the other fables. Scour is primarily a sideboard card that I packed for Prism to eat Spectral Shields and zero cost Spectra, and then set to eat Rune Chants and thus make rune gating more awkward. Neither of those heroes really turned out to Cincinnati, so the card was definitely dead weight in the list that weekend. I decided not to cut it before Chicago, though, as I had a suspicion that most players interested in Prism and Vincent simply weren't ready for day one, and after the extra week would be ready to go for Chicago. I was half right. There was a respectable number of Vincents at Chicago, but I didn't pair into any of them, and they weren't near the top tables, so across 21 rounds of 2 Battle Hardens, I played Scour 0 times. It's on thin ice for me, and pardon the pun. Interestingly, Scour does have some added utility into Viscerai. With Carapace, Viscerai can really easily run AB3 now, and there's a world where they try to build up 10 to 15 rune chants and kind of semi-OTK Iyslander. Scour is a great way to reset the progress toward that goal. Lastly, Warmonder's Diplomacy. Does this card need any introduction? I'm pretty sure when Battle Hardened Cincinnati started, the card was around the $8 mark, and by the time it was over, it was approaching $30. A week later, it was in at least 3 of the top 8 decks at Chicago, if not more. I'm not exactly sure. For those of you out of the loop, we are always interested in playing non-attack actions, so voting peace is free for us. There's a fair few heroes, though, that really like doing both attacks and non-attacks in the same turn. Viscerai and Azalea come to mind. This lets us really break up some of the tempo those decks would otherwise generate. A well-timed Diplomacy kind of cosplays Hypothermia, which was bannably good, and Diplomacy is a 3-block too. Do note there's a lot of interesting nuance around the timing of playing this card. If you play it as an instant on an opponent's turn, it affects their next turn, not the current turn. So keep that in mind as you slam it down on the table. And that's all the blues, which actually is most of the deck. We should probably cover the reds too, though. We're going to break these up into the same subcategories as before: ice cards, ice fusion cards, and other. Now, we're only running 2 red ice cards, and not for lack of trying, there just aren't many good options. Red Aether Hail is mediocre as on-rate arcane damage, but it at least is split up as an awkward 4+2, which is much harder for opponents with AB3 to block than 3+3. It also has really nice upside into Dromai, in that it cleanly kills basically all of the dragons, including Thamai and Miragai, while still letting us push 2 Arcane at the face for Moon. Red Hail is also a perfectly fine Stormstrider's target to close the game, which is one of my biggest reasons for playing it. Now don't get me wrong though, most times you draw this card, you're blocking 3 with it. Red Winter's Bite was first put on my radar by Michael Hamilton at the Calling Indianapolis, and what an all-star it has been for me. It's the only red ice card in the game that I'm both really happy arsenaling after fusing with it because its natural go again and its ability to guaranteed trade card for card with my opponent. I've tried Blue Winter's Bite a lot in the past, and it always had the same tunic issue for me as Coronet Peak. Upgrading the tax to 3 with the red really pushes this card over the edge. The fact that it pitches well to channel CLF is honestly just gravy. Our red Ice Fusion suite is also pretty simple. We play all the Aether Ice Veins. Yellow is an honorary red in this deck. Now, most opponents max out at AB3, so non-blue Aether Ice Veins are guaranteed to connect for arcane damage, and force opponents to pay the discard or to resource taps. They are some of our best tools to push damage and disrupt simultaneously. Basically, anytime I draw a non-blue Ice Vein, I'm going to try to play it that turn cycle, and if I can't fuse it, there's a lot of worlds where I stick it in Arsenal for the next turn cycle. Encase and Icebind are both here primarily to disrupt Lexi's hero flip and Arsenal-based play patterns. However, they're also perfectly fine into most other heroes too. At their floors, they're on-rate Arcane 0 for 3s that trigger Insidious Chill, so there's not much to complain about. Encase in particular has a lot of matchups it's kind of accidentally good in, including Phi, Azalea, and Uzuri, though that last one probably doesn't need the help. Just remember that it only freezes heroes and equipment, not weapons. Icebind is a very interesting card because I've gone from begrudgingly playing it to really enjoying it relatively recently. A fused Icebind inherently means that your opponent can't have a 5-card hand, because they either need to let their arsenal be frozen or ditch a blue to AB3. This is a great play when your opponent sits with Tunic at 3 so you can't coronet them. Since players naturally arsenal powerful cards, this means Icebind inherently trades either for a blue, which makes them much more susceptible to Frostbite, or one of your opponent's best cards on the turn cycle, whereas Coronet always trades for your opponent's worst or least useful card. This is a subtle but important note in favor of Icebind's power. Our other red cards are kind of self-explanatory. Sink Below is a great defensive tool versus reaction and breakpoint-based decks like Dorinthia and Katsu, as well as dominate-based decks like Bravo. It takes a lot of convincing to get me to play an Iyslander deck without at least 3 D-reacts, since we aren't a very aggressive hero, and we need to be able to answer our opponent's attacks. Fjendel's Fighting Spirit and Raging Onslaught are above-rate attacks for matchups where the Arcane 0 for 3s don't cut it. Now specifically, these 2 cards are 7-power poppers to get around Prism's Herald of Triumph. You have to be careful about when you present these in your 60 for a given matchup. I personally despise letting opponents with battle-worn or temper equipment essentially gaining free life when I play attack actions into them. And that's the 80, plus a brief explanation of the thought process behind including each of those 80 cards. Now, you do actually have to play with the cards though, and I always recommend playing exactly 60 except versus Arcane. It would take way too long to explain every sideboard decision I make in this video, so I'll just go over the broad strokes here. However, you can find a version of the deck in the description of this video that includes a complete sideboard guide for every matchup. I've generally found from experience that I want 42 blues out of my 60 card deck. The math on this works out that you'll see slightly more than 1 red per hand on average, which is perfect because we're okay with seeing like a Sink Below and another red, or a Winter's Bite and another red, in a single 4-card hand. I will say that in matchups I play Alluvian Constellus, I'm happy going a little higher on blues because pitching to Arcane Barrier is so good with that equipment that the surplus resources never feel like they're going to a waste. I'm currently only playing the attack actions versus Wizards, Illusionists, and Bravo sometimes. You specifically don't want to play them versus decks that can play Codex of Frailty. One of the worst feelings is a Codex ripping a fused Aether Ice Vein out of your hand. The last cut to get to 18 reds is usually Icebind or Encase, depending on if Encase is good in the matchup. Ask yourself if your opponent's hero has an important activated ability, or if they have a critical piece of equipment. If our opponent's damage doesn't strongly scale with the number of cards in hand, or blocking well is really important in the matchup, I'm also okay with cutting red Winter's Bite and leaving both 0 for 3s in. Playlines for this deck are kind of simple. Typically, you want to pitch a blue to play your arsenal on your opponent's turn, block with a card, Coronet Peak with a card, and arsenal your 4th card. Now, sometimes you forgo the block to play a Fused Aether Icevein, or forgo the Coronet Peak to play an Encase or Icebind. Where things get tricky are the little decision points. Do I want to arsenal this Blizzard and have maximum disruption for my opponent's next turn, but no arcane damage? Or do I want to arsenal this Emeritus Scolding and push damage this turn cycle, but not be so disruptive? A lot of these really depend on the current game state, and so they're hard to answer without context and a lot of practice. I personally stream Iyslander gameplay on Talishar specifically so that I can get recorded instances of these decision points out there on the internet and talk through them. If you're interested, check out the live tab on my channel homepage. I stream weekly-ish, Wednesday nights-ish. Now let's wrap things up with some general tips. First, pitching red ice cards to keep Channel Link Frigid out is probably worth it versus go wide heroes, even though it feels wrong. The exact math on CLF is kind of tricky, but more often than not, an extra turn of +1 taxes to everything is more beneficial than throwing out a red Aether Hail for 6. Don't forget that you can activate a Coronet Peak and overpitch by pitching a red ice card and then a blue ice card, leaving you with a resource floating and 2 cards in pitch. Speaking of red Aether Hail, be very careful about arsenaling it. Since it isn't a blue and we don't have Crown of Providence, you're committing to use your next turn to play it, which can lead to some very awkward play patterns. It's much safer to block with it or pitch it if there's a CLF out. In general, you also should probably be activating Coronet Peak more often than you think. It's not necessarily just a resource dump for when you draw 4 blues in a hand. I cannot understate the power of that equipment. Now, to build off that point, don't be afraid to arsenal reds, except for Red Hail. If you draw an Icevein and no ice cards, your best line is probably to block, activate Coronet, and put the Icevein in arsenal and wait for the next turn cycle. The same logic applies to red Winter's Bite. If you don't have a good blue arsenal card to disrupt your opponent or push damage on their turn, red Bite is a great arsenal to compensate on the next turn cycle by asking for an extra card worth of disruption from your opponent. I want to note that the way I play Iyslander is primarily an implied value deck, compared to Bully's explicit value. I'm much more interested in disrupting my opponents each turn cycle so they can't do anything meaningful, and finding windows for damage during those turns, rather than send a 2-card vanilla 8. There's something to be said for the evasiveness of arcane damage. Your opponent's cards don't block as well against it as they do physical damage, because they don't have nearly as many blues as they do 3 blocks typically. I strongly believe that both Boomer and Bully are completely viable ways to play the hero, and it's interesting to me that you can execute both game plans with nearly the same 80 cards. I personally think this deck, which excludes things like Enlightened Strike and Star for a Star, is better suited for this meta because of the prevalence of Codex of Frailty. Simply playing no attack actions means that you can't be disrupted by that card. I hope that this video has been help to all of you aspiring elemental wizards out there. If you need to pick up any of the cards that I talked about today to build your own Iyslander deck, go to minmaxgamesfab.com and use code ASCENT for 5% off your Flesh and Blood singles. It not only gives you a discount, but it also helps support me on Team Ascent. As always, if you enjoyed this video, please consider clicking like, subscribe, or even turning on notifications by ringing the bell. That one is especially useful to know when I'm going live for a stream. Also, feel free to leave a comment below. I'm usually pretty good at responding to them. Now, before I go, I'd like to make some special shoutouts. First and foremost, I would like to thank my good friends Levi Rauch and Kevin Breyer for being the catalysts that got me into content creation at all. Without them, this video wouldn't exist. I also would, of course, like to thank Team Ascent and our sponsor, MinMax Games. My team constantly challenges me to continue to excel as a player, and for that, I am eternally grateful, though the work is far from over. There's also the more informal team Eclipse, my group of locals and friends that offer me consistent paper games, many laughs, and many miles spent on the road going to events together. I joked on the Battle-Hardened Cincinnati stream that Team Eclipse is the best team you've never heard of. It features 2 different Battle-Hardened champions, a Pro Tour Top 16 competitor, a Calling Top 8 competitor, and more. You guys are the best. Lastly, I'd like to thank you, the viewers. The whole point of making this is to help you enjoy Flesh and Blood just as much as I do. I hope you got something useful out of this video. I'd like to conclude this video by announcing that I'm starting a Patreon. Now, I want to emphasize I am primarily invested in creating free, accessible content to better the community of this great game. I will never paywall a deck list or deck tech. Period. Now, to begin, I'll be starting the Patreon at 3 simple tiers. The $1 frosting tier is the easiest way to show your support for the channel. It also comes with the fun little benefit of a custom on-hit effect card back to use on Talishar. You'll be seeing it a lot in my future streams. The $3 Aether Hail tier will include your name in a credit scroll that would look something like this at the end of future videos I make, in addition to the thanks for watching screen at the end of each of my streams. And lastly, the $5 Ice Bolt tier will get their names highlighted at the start of videos and on the starting soon and be right back screens of my streams, as well as me reading the names aloud during the credit rolls at the end of various videos and streams as an extra special thank you. I'm also considering adding one additional tier to offer one-on-one coaching in the future. I'm unsure if this would be a private matter or streamed publicly. The time-intensive nature of this perk would mean this hypothetical tier would be very limited and quite expensive. If you're interested in something like this, please leave a comment or at me on Twitter expressing interest so I can see if it's something worth adding. Stay icy, everyone.